The invitation had arrived without drama, slipped between contracts and studio schedules like something unimportant, almost forgettable. A private precision exhibition at an elite sports facility outside Palm Springs. No cameras, no press. Just a gathering of nationally ranked professional shooters. Olympic-level coaches, retired military instructors, and a few wealthy patrons who liked to collect rare experiences the way others collected watches. Dean Martin almost didn't go. He had a recording session the next morning, a charity dinner the night after, and a quiet promise he had made to himself to stop saying yes to things that pulled him away from the small, human moments he treasured most. But there was something about the letter that lingered in his mind long after he had set it down. The wording was polite but dismissive, respectful yet edged with challenge. Several professionals have expressed curiosity about whether your reputed hand-eye coordination is performance or reality. There was no insult in the sentence, yet somehow it carried one. Not toward his fame, but toward the unseen part of him. The part no audience ever applauded. The part he rarely let anyone witness. The facility sat like a quiet monument in the desert, tall pale stone and wide glass, reflecting a sky so open it made even confident men feel small. It was the kind of place where voices naturally softened, where footsteps seemed to echo longer than they should, where the air itself felt expensive. Dean arrived without entourage, without announcement. He wore no tailored suit, no stage smile. Just a simple dark jacket, open at the collar, sunglasses resting in his hand instead of on his face. A few people recognized him immediately, of course. Whispers traveled faster than footsteps. But something in his unhurried walk, in the way he paused to greet the receptionist, to thank the attendant who offered him water, subtly disarmed the attention. He didn't arrive like a star. He arrived like a guest. Inside the main hall, the professionals were already gathered. There were men and women whose names never appeared on marquees, but were spoken with reverence in very narrow circles. People who could measure their own breathing and heartbeats, who understood time and fractions most people couldn't even imagine. Their world was built on precision, discipline, and the unforgiving honesty of performance. In their world, reputation meant little. Results meant everything. Several of them stood near the long glass wall overlooking the range. Arms crossed, posture rigid, the quiet confidence of people who had proven themselves thousands of times. And there, threaded through their low conversation, was amusement, curiosity, and yes, a trace of mockery. "That's him." One of them murmured, not quite softly enough. "The singer? He played in movies," another replied. "Doesn't mean he belongs here." They weren't cruel. Not openly. But there was a shared assumption moving among them like an unspoken rule. Dean Martin was entertainment. They were mastery. He was timing for applause. They were timing for truth. Dean felt none of it as hostility, only as distance. He had lived long enough to recognize that tone. It was the sound of a door that had not yet decided whether it would open. The host, silver-haired patron named Caldwell, greeted him warmly, guiding him through brief introductions. Names were exchanged. Hands were shaken. Polite smiles appeared, the kind that lived only on the surface of faces. Dean listened more than he spoke. He always had. It unsettled people sometimes, the way he absorbed rooms instead of filling them. One of the instructors, a man with a voice like gravel and eyes like still water, studied him openly. So, the man finally said, not unkindly but plainly, "What brings you here, Mr. Martin?" Dean considered the question longer than most would. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he wanted the honest one. "I was curious," he said at last. "I've spent most of my life in rooms where people clap. I thought I'd like to stand in one where they don't." Few of them smiled. A few didn't, but the tone and the space shifted, just slightly. Curiosity edged out dismissal. Still, skepticism lingered. The exhibition began as scheduled. The professionals demonstrated first, one after another. Their movements were clean, efficient, nearly invisible. There was no wasted motion, no flair. Only outcome. Digital readouts blinked. Timers chirped. Small nods followed successful sequences. This was their language. Dean watched with genuine interest, leaning slightly forward, hands loosely folded, as if attending a rehearsal rather than a challenge. When Caldwell finally gestured toward him, the conversation hushed. "Mr. Martin has agreed," Caldwell announced, "to try a single sequence. For experience only." A ripple of restrained amusement passed through the group. Experience. Yes, that surely was safe. Dean stepped forward without removing his jacket. He didn't ask for instruction. He didn't make a show of confidence. He merely observed the setup, eyes moving across distances, light, alignment, rhythm. To most, it would have looked like nothing. To those trained to see, it looked like listening. One of the professionals leaned toward another. "He's studying like he plans to act," she whispered. "Not perform." Dean took his position. The equipment was adjusted to a beginner's configuration, not out of malice, but courtesy. Something manageable. Something forgiving. The timer was set. Caldwell raised a hand. "Whenever you're ready." Dean didn't answer. He didn't need to. He closed his eyes, not in ceremony. In memory, the desert air, the murmurs, the glass, all seemed to fall away. In their place rose something older. A quiet morning long before stages, long before studios, long before the world had decided who he was supposed to be. A small backyard. Tin cans balanced on a fence. A man whose hands were always rough, but always gentle. A voice that never praised loudly, but corrected patiently. Dean felt that presence the way one feels warmth from a distant fire. Not as nostalgia. As grounding. When he opened his eyes, the change was subtle, but real. His shoulders lowered. His breathing found a slower rhythm. He wasn't preparing to impress. He was preparing to align. The first sequence began. Dean moved. It was not fast. That was the first surprise. He didn't rush. He didn't chase the moment. He let it arrive. His motions were smooth, economical, almost unnoticeable. The timer chimed. The digital board updated. The result was respectable. Nothing extraordinary, but not amateur. Several of the professionals exchanged glances. That wasn't luck. That was coordination. Dean stepped back, nodding politely, as if he had just completed a warm-up stretch. A few light claps followed, more from courtesy than admiration. Caldwell smiled, relieved. "Well," he said. For a first again, someone interrupted. The voice belonged to a younger competitor. One who had placed internationally, whose career had been built on proving people wrong. There was no hostility in his tone. Only interest sharpened into something more demanding. Again, the man repeated. Same sequence. Caldwell hesitated, then looked to Dean. Dean met his eyes. Then the younger man's. "If you'd like," Dean said. The setup was reset. This time, fewer murmurs. More watching. Dean took his place once more. Again, he closed his eyes, but only for a breath. Not to remember now, but to remove. To clear away the eyes on him, the expectations, the unspoken comparisons. When he opened them, there was no one else in the room. Only timing. The second run was different. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but decisively. His movements seemed to shorten, not in distance, but in intention. There was no pause between decision and action. They touched. The timer chimed again. The board updated this time. The result was unmistakably good. No one clapped. They didn't know how. Conversations died in half sentences. Arms slowly uncrossed. One of the coaches stepped closer to the display, then back, then closer again, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves out of embarrassment. "That wasn't accidental," someone murmured. Dean simply exhaled, stepped aside, and reached for the water bottle he had been given earlier. He didn't look at the board. He didn't look at the faces. He had already seen what he needed to see. The same gravel-voiced instructor from before approached him, slower now, studying not the equipment but the man. "Where did you learn to move like that?" he asked. Dean smiled faintly. "By being very bad at it," he said. For a very long time, there was a pause. Then, unexpectedly, a soft laugh from the instructor. Not mocking, appreciative. The professionals gathered closer now. Questions followed, but not about fame. About practice. About habits. About mental framing. Dean answered them gently, never overstating, never claiming. He spoke of mornings when he arose before sunlight, not to train, but to be quiet. Of the discipline of repetition without witnesses. Of learning to separate identity from outcome. He did not speak like a celebrity explaining a hobby. He spoke like someone describing a private language. It was then that Caldwell cleared his throat. There is, said, one final demonstration planned today. A professional challenge sequence. It requires a response time most people cannot physically register. We had not intended. Dean met his eyes. I'd like to watch, he said. Several of the professionals glanced at one another. The younger competitor from before smiled slightly. You may find it discouraging, he said. Dean returned the smile, not with bravado, but with something closer to gratitude. Then it will be honest. They prepared the sequence. Adjustments were made. Timers recalibrated. The environment subtly changed, as though the room itself had leaned forward. This was the part of the exhibition that separated the very good from the exceptional. The sequence designed to humble, to remind, to enforce hierarchy. The professionals ran it first. Their performances were extraordinary. The margins between them were so small they could only be measured, not seen. When it ended, the board displayed a range of elite times. Impressive, difficult. Human. Dean was not invited forward. Not yet. But he felt something stir. Not in pride, but recognition. The same quiet alignment he had felt before, only deeper now, more precise. Caldwell turned toward him, uncertain, polite. Mr. Martin, of course. There is no expectation. Dean stepped forward anyway. May I? He asked. No one laughed. No one spoke. They made room. Dean removed his jacket this time, folding it carefully over a chair, as if preparing not for a performance, but for work. He studied the setup once more. Longer now. His eyes tracked not the obvious, but the negative spaces. The places where time hid, where hesitation was born. When he finally took his position, there was a stillness about him that felt deliberate. As though he were standing inside a thought. The timer was readied. Caldwell raised his hand. The room held its breath. And somewhere, in a space too small for words, Dean Martin prepared to make a decision that would unfold in less than a quarter of a second, and change the way everyone in that room understood him forever. The room no longer felt like a facility. It felt like a chamber of judgment, not because anyone had spoken harshly, but because silence had taken on weight. The kind of silence that presses gently against the ears, that makes even experienced professionals aware of their own breathing. Dean stood at the line with his shoulders loose, spine straight, eyes open but distant, as if he were looking not at what stood before him, but through it, into something only he could see. Around him, the men and women who had spent decades mastering fractions of moments now found themselves unsettled by the way he inhabited one. There was no tension in his body, no visible urgency, and yet the atmosphere tightened, as though the air itself were preparing for something it could not yet name. Caldwell lowered his raised hand slightly, hesitating. He had hosted exhibitions like this for years. He knew the rhythm of challenge. The swagger before it. The release after. This felt different. This felt like the quiet before weather changes. He cleared his throat, glanced at the lead instructor, and back at Dean. This sequence, he said carefully, is designed to overwhelm reaction. Most people fail not because they lack skill, but because they attempt control when they should allow instinct. Even our best participants rarely improve after the first attempt. Dean nodded once, slow and respectful, absorbing the words without responding to them. He had learned long ago that warnings were not meant to stop you, but to reveal what frightened the person offering them. He placed his feet not in the standard professional stance, but in something subtler, something adapted. It was almost unnoticeable, but to trained eyes it looked personal, as though he were standing the way his body preferred, not the way manuals prescribed. One of the coaches narrowed his eyes. "That's not regulation," he murmured. "No," the gravel-voiced instructor replied quietly. "It's ownership." The younger competitor, who had challenged him earlier, leaned forward, resting his forearms on the barrier. He wasn't smiling now. His jaw was set, eyes intent, the way they became before international finals. "He's not here to try," he whispered. "He's here to answer something." The range technician completed the final calibration. The digital display blinked once, twice, then settled into readiness. Caldwell raised his hand again, this time without hesitation. "Whenever you're ready." Dean did not close his eyes this time, instead. He lowered his gaze to the floor for a brief moment, and in that gesture lived an entire unseen life. The years when applause had been something he dreamed of, not something he owned. The mornings when he practiced alone in borrowed spaces with no audience but dust motes drifting through sunbeams. The nights when failure had sat across from him like a patient teacher, correcting him without mercy. He thought of the people who had laughed kindly, and the ones who had laughed carelessly, and how neither had ever truly known him. Then he lifted his head. The first run began. The opening movement was clean. The room exhaled slightly. The professionals followed each micromotion, their trained eyes mapping angles, transitions, minute hesitations. Dean's response was fast, but not extraordinary. Yet he moved like someone walking a familiar hallway in the dark. Hands grazing the walls not to orient himself, but to acknowledge them. The timer chimed. The board updated. A ripple passed through the room. It wasn't disbelief. It was recalibration. He had placed within the professional, ranged not at the bottom, not near the bottom. Within someone let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The younger competitor straightened slowly. The lead coach frowned, not in irritation, but in analysis. Numbers were discussed in hushed tones. Margins were measured. Dean stepped back from the line, nodded once, and reached again for his water. He drank slowly, as though nothing of importance had occurred. Caldwell smiled with relief that bordered on disbelief. That, he said lightly, was remarkably composed. Dean replaced the bottle. "I wasn't finished," he said gently. The words did not ring with arrogance. They rang with recognition. As though he had heard a melody stop before its final note. The room stilled again. "You'd like another attempt?" Caldwell asked. "If the sequence allows," Dean replied. The technician hesitated. This exhibition had a structure, demonstration, participation, observation. What was unfolding had slipped between categories. But Caldwell nodded. "Reset."
Yes.
The equipment was adjusted, something subtle but powerful shifted among the professionals. The easy hierarchy of before had cracked. They were no longer observing an outsider. They were tracking an unknown. And unknowns in their world were dangerous in the best way. One of the women, a former national champion, crossed her arms again, not defensively, thoughtfully. "He's not chasing speed," she said quietly to the instructor beside her. "He's compressing decision." The instructor glanced at her. "Explain." "She watches for openings," the woman continued. "He's watching for absence." The sequence reset. Dean returned to position. This time, he adjusted his stance by less than an inch. He rolled his shoulders once, not to loosen them, but to settle them. His face had not changed, but something behind it had sharpened, as though a lens had quietly focused. Caldwell raised his hand. The timer began. This run was different from the first. Extant. There was no warm-up in his movement. No searching. The moment the sequence initiated, Dean's body answered as if it had already been asked. The transition shortened. The negative spaces between actions collapsed. It was not that he moved faster. It was that less of him moved. The professionals began to lean forward in unison, as though pulled by the same invisible thread. The room filled with the soft mechanical rhythms of the system. Each one met not with reaction, but with arrival. The timer chimed. The display updated. No one spoke. They stared. Not because The number was impossible, because it should not have belonged to him. He had not merely improved, he had crossed. There is a point in elite disciplines where progression stops being linear and becomes categorical, where one is no longer better than before, but something else than before. Dean's second result sat there in that narrow, unsettling place. "That's—" the younger competitor began, then stopped. The gravel-voiced instructor took a slow step forward. He studied the board, then Dean, then the board again. His voice, when it came, had lost its edge. "That response time," he said, "requires precision. You cannot achieve it by seeing and then acting." Dean nodded. "I know." "Then how did you—" "I didn't wait," Dean said softly. The simplicity of the answer unsettled them more than any boast could have. The instructor's brow furrowed. "Wait for what?" "For the moment," Dean replied. "I met it." Silence deepened. Caldwell laughed once, uncertainly, as if trying to lighten a room that refused to be lightened. "Well," he said, "you've certainly made your participation memorable." Dean met his gaze. "There is one more way to run it," said. The technician froze mid-adjustment. The professional slowly turned toward Dean. "There is?" Caldwell asked. Dean nodded. "The way you don't demonstrate." A quiet murmur passed through the group. The younger competitor's eyes narrowed. "What way is that?" he asked. Dean gestured lightly toward the setup. "The way that cannot be trained," he said. "Only remembered." The instructor felt a chill move across his shoulders. "Mr. Martin," he said carefully, "this sequence already presses the edge of human response. There's no sanctioned configuration beyond it." Dean smiled faintly. "I'm not asking for sanction." Caldwell hesitated. He was a patron, not a professional. He had organized this day as entertainment, as curiosity. But something older than event planning was now in the room. Something like inquiry. He looked at the instructor, then at the technician, then back at Dean. "What are you proposing?" he asked. Dean did not answer immediately. He walked a slow circle near the line, eyes lowered, as if listening to the floor. When he spoke, it was almost to himself. "There is a delay built into every system," he said. "Not mechanical, human. The assumption that we must receive before we may respond. That assumption creates a gap. That gap is where hesitation lives. That hesitation is where time is lost." The woman who had spoken earlier inhaled sharply. "You're talking about anticipatory synchronization," she said. "But that level of is not anticipation," Dean interrupted gently. "It is agreement." They looked at him, puzzled. "Agreement with what?" the younger competitor asked. "With inevitability," Dean replied. Caldwell swallowed. "Dean, what exactly are you suggesting we change?" Dean turned to the technician. "I'd like the sequence to run," he said, "without a start cue." The technician stared at him. "That's not possible." "The system must initiate." "Let it initiate," Dean said. "Just don't tell me when." Stir ran through the room. The instructor stepped forward. "You're asking to stand blind to initiation," he said. "That removes the very anchor professionals rely on." "Ah!" Dean nodded. "Yes. Why would you do that?" Dean lifted his eyes, and in them was something that made the question suddenly feel small. "Because anchors," he said, "are what keeps ships from discovering oceans." No one laughed. No one dismissed him. The room did something rarer. It considered. Caldwell exhaled slowly. "If we do this," he said, "it will not be comparable to any professional metric." Oh. Dean inclined his head. "I'm not here to be measured," he said. "I'm here to finish something." The technician looked to the instructor. The instructor closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "Prepare the sequence," he said. "Random initiation. No audible cue." The technician's hands moved. The room drew in. Dean returned to position this time. He did close his eyes, and he did not open them. The lights glowed softly across the range. The systems hummed, patient, waiting for the unseen algorithm to decide its moment. Dean's breathing slowed, then softened, then seemed almost to disappear. His hands rested not in readiness, but in presence. He was no longer preparing to act. He was allowing himself to be where action was born. Around him, the professionals felt it. The shift. The strange sense that something had begun without having started. Seconds stretched. Or perhaps they didn't. No one could tell. Time, unanchored, lost its familiar edges. Somewhere within the system, a silent threshold was crossed. And in less than the space of a single heartbeat, Dean Martin moved. What followed would not be described. Later, in terms of technique, it would be described in terms of disbelief, and in exactly 0.20 seconds, a line that none of them had known existed was about to be erased. Asterisk time did not move forward. It seemed to loosen. The professionals would later struggle to explain that feeling. How the seconds before it happened did not stack neatly like they always had, but instead spread outward, thin and transparent, as though the room itself were holding its breath in layers. Dean stood at the line with his eyes closed, hands resting loosely at his sides. Not in a stance of readiness, but in a posture of surrender. The equipment waited in its programmed uncertainty, designed to initiate at a moment no human could predict. No signal, no sound, no warning. To the people who had trained their entire lives to dominate response, this was the purest form of disadvantage. To Dean, it felt like home. His breathing was so quiet it could not be tracked. His shoulders did not rise or fall in any way that suggested preparation. His face was empty of performance. What lived there instead was stillness so complete it unsettled those watching. The younger competitor felt a tightness in his chest he did not recognize. The former champion found her fingers curling unconsciously, as if around something fragile. The gravel-voiced instructor leaned forward, then stopped himself. Sensing that even movement from him might fracture whatever invisible architecture was forming in the space between, Dean in the waiting system. Somewhere in the machinery, a hidden counter reached 0. That sequence initiated. No one heard it begin. No one saw. The first moment, because the first moment did not belong to their eyes. It belonged to Dean. He did not react. He arrived. The difference was subtle only in language. In reality, it was absolute. Where reaction is a leap across a gap, arrival is the absence of one. Where reaction is the body chasing an event, arrival is the body already standing inside it. Those who would later replay the footage frame by frame would argue over the first measurable motion, the first shift of muscle, the first visible confirmation that something had occurred. But in the room, in the unrecorded, unrepeatable present, there was no first movement. There was only the sudden awareness that movement had already completed something the mind had not yet named. Dean's body unfolded in a single, seamless articulation. There was no visible acceleration, no tensing before release. One moment he was still, the next, he was not. It was not speed that struck the room. It was an inevitability. The way a page seems to turn itself when the story has reached its next sentence. The system responded. The timer, programmed to chirp at the end of human possibility, emitted a sound so quick it startled. Even the technician, the digital display blinked, then resolved. For a fraction of a second, no one understood what they were seeing. The numbers were there, clear, unambiguous. But the brain resists data. When it contradicts the story it has built of the world, a soft murmur rose, then died, then tried again in another corner of the room. The younger competitor took a step forward before he realized he had moved. The former champion pressed a hand lightly to her mouth, not in shock, but in something closer to reverence. The gravel-voiced instructor did not move at all. "Read it," someone whispered. The technician's lips parted, then closed, then parted again. 0.20, he said finally. 0 seconds. The words sounded wrong even as he spoke them. In their world, response times were measured in tenths, then hundredths, then theoretical limits. But 0.20 seconds sat in a place beyond impressive. It hovered on the edge of what the nervous system itself was believed to permit under any condition. It was not merely elite, it was disobedient. Caldwell felt his throat tighten. That's not within the competitive range, he said faintly. The technician shook his head slowly, eyes never leaving the board. It's within the mechanical range, he said. But to reach it without a cue, he trailed off. Dean had not yet opened his eyes. His hands returned gently to rest. His shoulders settled. His breathing resumed, quiet, unforced, human. Only then did he open his eyes. And when he did, the first thing he saw was not the display, it was the faces. He saw men and women who had built their lives on mastery, looking at him not with defeat, not with envy, but with the fragile astonishment of students encountering a language they did not know existed. He saw the younger competitor's certainty fractured into something raw and honest. He saw the former champion's eyes glistening not with loss, but with discovery. He saw the instructor, the unmovable one, standing as if something deep in him had just shifted its weight. Dean exhaled softly. The instructor was the first to speak, that he said, and his voice was no longer gravel but water. Was not trained. Dean considered the statement. Some of it was, he said gently, but not the part you're asking about. What part are we asking about? Caldwell said. The part that did not wait. Dean replied. The younger competitor shook his head once, as though clearing fog. You didn't anticipate, he said. There was no micro-flinch, no preparatory contraction. We would have seen it. We always do. Dean nodded. Because you look for beginnings, he said. I learned to look for endings. They stared at him. When something truly begins, Dean continued, it is already decided how it will end. Most of us spend our lives trying to catch up to that decision. Speed is the art of closing the gap. Stillness is the art of removing it. The former champion swallowed. That sounds like philosophy, she said. Dean smiled faintly. It is physiology, he replied. Your body knows what your mind keeps interrupting. Caldwell glanced back at the board as if it might offer another explanation. It did not. The number remained, impassive, unimpressed by the turmoil it had caused. How long? The instructor asked quietly, Have you been able to do that? Dean's gaze softened, drifting not to the past as an image, but as a sensation. I couldn't always, he said. For most of my life, I was very fast. People praised that. They thought it was talent. They were wrong. Speed is often fear dressed as skill. It wants to arrive before doubt does. What you saw just now. He paused, searching not for words, but for honesty. What you saw just now took me longer than anything else I've ever learned. The room listened the way one listens to rain after a long heat. I had to unlearn urgency, Dean continued. Unlearn applause. Unlearn the reflex to prove. I had to become willing to be late in every room. Willing to lose. Willing to be unseen. Because only when I stopped racing moments, did moments stop running from me? No one interrupted. Not because they were polite, because something in them recognized truth. The younger competitor rubbed his palms together slowly. A nervous habit he had abandoned years ago. That gap you talked about, he said. Between event and action. That's where careers are made. And broken. Dean nodded. Yes, you erased it. No, Dean said. I stepped out of it. The technician finally looked away from the board. I've worked with national teams, he said quietly. I've seen people shave thousands off response times through biofeedback, neural training, conditioned reflex loops. But this? He hesitated. This isn't optimization. Dean met his eyes. It's permission, he said. Permission to do what? To trust what moves before you think, Dean replied. The former champion exhaled slowly. We're taught to control, she said. Every instinct, every impulse, until only what can be measured remains. Dean inclined his head. Control is useful, he said, until it becomes a wall. Then it only protects you from yourself. The instructor stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance. Why show us this? He asked. You didn't come here for spectacle. That much is clear. Dean looked at the faces again. The ones that had once held polite dismissal. The ones that now held questions they had not prepared. Because, he said, every discipline reaches a point where its greatest enemy is not failure, but familiarity. You all live where margins are so thin they feel like destiny. I came to remind you that margins are stories we tell ourselves when we are afraid to rewrite the page. Silence held. Then, unexpectedly, the younger competitor laughed once. Not mockingly. Not bitterly. But in the way a person laughs when they finally see a joke they have been standing inside for years. I thought you were here because of your hands. He said. Dean smiled. I was, he replied. Just not the way you meant. Caldwell felt something warm move behind his eyes. He had funded theaters, exhibitions, orchestras. He had believed himself a patron of art. Only now did he understand how rarely he had been present for it. What will you do now? He asked. Dean reached for his jacket, draping it over his arm. I'll go home, he said. I have a rehearsal tomorrow morning. The simplicity of the answer, after what they had witnessed, struck the room like a final quiet note. As Dean turned to leave, the instructor spoke once more. Mr. Martin, he said. Dean paused. What you did just now? People will want to study it, replicate it, systematize it. Dean looked back, and there was no pride in his expression, only kindness. They may study the shape of it, he said. They may even build beautiful methods from it. But the thing itself, he touched his chest lightly. The thing itself only comes when the need to own it is gone. He inclined his head once and began to walk away. Behind him, the digital display still glowed 0.20 not as a record, but as a reminder that royalty, real royalty, is not how quickly you move. It is how completely you are already there. Dean had almost reached the glass doors when the room behind him finally remembered how to breathe. The sound came back in layers. A chair shifting. A slow exhale. A quiet, unsteady laugh. But no one called after him. Not yet. It was as though something sacred had passed through the space, and instinct demanded stillness before speech. The professionals remained where they were, not because they had been instructed to, but because movement felt premature, like stepping into a river before understanding its current. The glowing number still hovered on the display, indifferent to the weight it now carried, but the people were no longer looking at it. They were looking at one another, as if silently asking the same question. What have we just witnessed? Caldwell was the first to break the stillness. He did not raise his voice. He did not attempt to reclaim the role of host. He simply spoke as a man who had unexpectedly been placed inside a moment that would outlive him. He didn't defeat anyone, he said quietly. And yet, I don't think any of us are standing where we were, the gravel-voiced instructor nodded once. Because what he did wasn't about being better, he said. It was about being free. The younger competitor had not moved since Dean turned away. His eyes followed the place where Dean had been, not as though searching for him, but as though trying to locate the version of himself that now felt suddenly incomplete. I've spent 15 years, he said slowly, training to arrive earlier than everyone else. And he just showed me what it looks like to arrive before arrival exists. The former champion closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were wet but steady. We measure everything, she said. We reduce the human being to output, to efficiency. 2 decimals. And he walks in and reminds us that what moves fastest is not muscle. The technician leaned back against the console, the glow of the board reflecting faintly across his face. I thought this room was about limits, he said. I don't think it is anymore. Beyond the glass doors, Dean moved down the long, sunlit corridor alone. The facility seemed quieter now, though nothing in it had changed. The same pale stone, the same reflections, the same distant hum of systems doing what they had been built to do. Yet for him, something had settled, not in triumph. In completion, he had not come to impress. He had not come to teach. He had come because something unfinished had asked to be closed, and now it was. He stepped outside into the desert light. The air was warm but not heavy. A soft wind moved across the open space, lifting grains of sand that glimmered briefly before falling back into their patient arrangement. Dean paused, not because he needed to, but because he had learned that moments offered themselves only to those willing to notice them. He closed his eyes just once more and let the warmth touch his face. A memory rose, uninvited, not of applause, not of stages, but of a boy standing in a narrow yard. Long before he had learned how to be anyone worth inviting anywhere, the fence had been old, the boards uneven, the nails rusted. Tin cans had been balanced carefully along its length. He had been young enough then to believe that precision was something you forced from your hands. He remembered how they had trembled, how his jaw had clenched, how his breath had rushed ahead of him as if afraid to be left behind. He remembered the man beside him, older, quieter, never raising his voice. He had not corrected him with instruction. He had corrected him with presence. He had stood close, not to guide the hands, but to slow the boy. "You're trying to be quick," the man had said. The boy had nodded. "That's why you're late," the man had replied. The memory did not ache. It smiled. Dean opened his eyes again and turned slightly, surprised to find Caldwell standing a few paces behind him. The older man had followed at a respectful distance, not wishing to interrupt whatever silence had accompanied Dean from the room. "I hope you'll forgive me," Caldwell said. "I didn't want this to end without thanking you." Dean inclined his head. "There's nothing to thank." "There is," Caldwell said. "You could have performed. You chose to reveal." Dean studied him gently. "They're not the same thing," he said. "No," Caldwell agreed, "and I suspect one is much rarer." They stood in the light, two men who had spent long lives in crowded places, unexpectedly sharing a quiet one. "May I ask you something?" Caldwell said. Dean nodded. "When you stood there," Caldwell continued, "with no cue, no signal, weren't you afraid of missing it?" Dean smiled faintly. "I used to be," he said. "For many years, I missed more than I met. I thought that was failure. It wasn't. It was education." "Education in what?" "In discovering that moments do not reward pursuit," Dean replied. "They respond to readiness." Caldwell looked out across the open space. "Readiness," he repeated. "Yes," Dean said. "Not the readiness of tension. The readiness of allowance," Caldwell exhaled slowly. "Most people live as if life were something to outrun." Dean nodded. "And most arrive exhausted." They stood for another moment. Then Caldwell spoke again, softer now. "You've changed the way some of the finest professionals I know will see their work. That isn't a small thing." Dean's expression did not change, but something in it warmed. "If they choose to let it," he said, "no one is transformed by what they witness, only by what they permit." From inside the facility, the doors opened. The younger competitors stepped out, hesitant, as though unsure whether he was allowed into this quieter world. He stopped a few paces away, hands at his sides. "Mr. Martin," he said. Dean turned to him. "I don't know what to call what you did," the younger man continued. "It doesn't fit our language. But I think I've been living my entire career inside a fraction of myself." Dean regarded him kindly. "Most people do," he said. "Not because they lack depth, because they are rewarded for surfaces." The younger man swallowed. "If I wanted to find what you found, where would I begin?" Dean did not answer immediately. He glanced once toward the horizon, where heat softened the edges of distance. Then he looked back. "Begin," he said, "by becoming willing to be slow where you are praised for being fast. Begin by practicing when there is nothing to win. Begin by letting your body finish sentences your mind keeps interrupting. And above all, begin by failing in rooms that do not clap." The younger man nodded. As if committing something fragile to memory, the former champion and the instructor had now stepped into the light as well. Keeping a respectful distance, yet clearly unwilling to let the moment dissolve without acknowledgement, the instructor spoke, his voice quiet, stripped of its former edge. "There are people in our world," he said, "who will insist what you did can be reduced, that it can be engineered." Dean smiled gently. They are not wrong, he said. They will build tools, and those tools will help many. But what they will not build is the courage to let go of them. The former champion felt a soft, unexpected laugh leave her. You make mastery sound like surrender. Dean met her eyes. It is, he said, just not to weakness, to truth. Caldwell felt something in his chest loosen. Then what? He asked. Is the royal move everyone here will speak about after today? Dean considered the phrase, then shook his head lightly. There was no royal move, he said. Only a royal absence. Absence of what? The younger competitor asked. Of the need to be crowned, Dean replied. They stood in silence again, but it was a different silence now. Not the charged hush of anticipation, the spacious quiet of recognition. At last, Dean shifted his jacket higher on his arm. I should go, he said. Caldwell nodded. Of course. As Dean took a step away, the instructor spoke one final time. Mr. Martin, today you entered a room where people measured their worth in tenths of seconds, and you gave them something they can't time. Dean paused, then inclined his head once. Then, he said softly, perhaps they'll finally have time. He walked away. Inside the facility, the professionals did not rush back to their demonstrations. No one reset the system. No one returned to the board. They remained where they were, not out of confusion, but out of respect for something that had altered the air. And long after the number on the display dimmed, long after the equipment returned to its neutral hum, something else stayed luminous. The understanding that greatness is not what happens in the moment everyone sees. It is what has already happened in the moments no one ever will. And somewhere, far from applause, far from exhibition halls and glowing numbers, Dean Martin drove back toward a life that would never mention what had occurred that day. He would go to rehearsal. He would greet people kindly. He would laugh easily. And no one there would know that he had stood inside a fraction of a second and turned it into a quiet kingdom, not of dominance, but of presence, not of speed, but of sovereignty. Because true royalty is not how quickly you can move when the world demands. Proof? It is how completely you can arrive when no one is asking.